we just call it sermon planning. Again, that's not self-explanatory, but it is a meeting that happens with 7 to 10 of our staff and whoever is going to preach that week, where they come in prepared, like you said, maybe 50% done or 40 to 60%, something like that. And the theology part's almost totally buttoned up. It's just not, maybe in a form that is real applicable yet or very illustrative yet. Yeah. And then we bring that to them, we walk through it, and we just talk about it. We talk about all the facets of it. And in so doing, 2 things happen. We get better sermons and we get better preachers. So let's take it in turn, okay? Jonathan, I want you to be on the podcast. I want you to talk about any of this that you want to, primarily, though, to talk about the development side, because that's what you're into and you lead all these cohorts and that kind of thing. But first, let's talk about how sermons get better when we talk about them on the front end in community.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go. Hey everybody, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. If you've been enjoying the podcast so far, we want to invite you to our conference coming up in September. We know that multiplication, sending, and discipleship is the goal of the church. People generally don't have a problem saying that. But what we have found is that the ultimate input for the output of sending is growth. Many times we get so focused on the output of sending that we forget to put any emphasis at all on the input of growth. And that's why we're here. We want to help shift the narrative towards growing and going, and that's what we'll spend the bulk of our time on at the conference, with practical strategies and insights that bring discipleship, sending, and growth back together. Click the link to get your spot, September 17th and 18th. We'll see you there.
All right. Hey, guys, welcome back to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Andrew Hopper, and I'm here with Pastor Jonathan Yarborough, who is making frequent visits here on the podcast and becoming a mainstay, so we're excited for that. Hey, today we're going to be talking about, I think, one of the most important issues. Now, we're going to dial in on a specific part of the important issue, but one of the most important issues when it comes to church growth and going, I think, would be the preaching of the word. And how we develop preachers and how the sermons get better. We're unapologetic in saying that we think probably the most important event that happens during the week for the evangelism of our communities and for the discipleship of our people is the church gathering. And most of that, a lot of that has to do with the actual preaching of God's word, the opening of God's word.
I'd take it even a step further than that. The part of the church that I lead is the sending arm of the church. And so a lot of people would tend to think you're not going to be as concerned about the preaching on Sunday because what you're worried about is people leaving. But what a lot of folks don't understand is that we never get people to go unless we put a lot of energy and make the weekend really, really good. Because just as you're talking about, that's where people get discipled. Primarily, that's where it first starts, is when they are hearing the sermon. That's what shapes their hearts for the nations. That's what shapes their heart for God. And so when they get good preaching on a regular basis like that, it just informs everything that happens after that.
Yeah, and I remember years ago at one of those advanced things, when advance was a thing through 829 and all that. I mean, this is probably 15 years ago, but I heard one of the most prominent preachers, I think, in the state of North Carolina, and he was talking about church planting, and he said there's a principle called YBCHP, and that acronym stands for but can he preach?
Oh, yeah.
And the idea was, man, you can have it all.
Yeah.
You can have the prospectus, you can have the systems, you can have the whatever.
All the strategies and all that
But at the end of the day, man, do you have that preaching gift that is compelling? It moves people from where they are to where they want to be, and also can be evangelistic and really call people. And obviously, these are giftings and empowerment from the Spirit. They're God-given, but like any other thing that God has given us,
you got to feed it.
Yeah, we can do all things to the glory of God, including setting up systems and strategies for trying to get better in this area of our life. And so there's a lot of things we could talk about with that. The podcast today is not my process or that kind of stuff. It's not even really getting into gospel centrality and our philosophy of preaching so much. We want to talk about one of the most effective tools that we have ever seen for hitting two birds with one stone. That is making sermons better on an individual basis in terms of week after week after week, and developing better preachers for the long term of either being on a plurality of elders and preaching on our staff like you do, like other guys do on our staff, or eventually, going out and planting churches. We want to do both of those things. We want to get better and we want to develop guys.
I was just thinking about this, that when I first came on staff here and started getting around everything, what we're going to be talking about here was something that was brand new to me. And so I thought it was just super helpful in being able to see how all of that worked, because it wasn't something that I had ever seen before.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was, I preached we come a little bit from the same generation. I know you're a little bit older than me, but I preached a lot before I ever got introduced to a way of learning how to preach.
Right.
I really would credit my time at the Summit Church in Raleigh, Durham with kind of more of an intentional process of how I learned to preach. But I grew up in an awesome church that loved the Lord, loved the Bible, small at that time, was kind of a rural, not crazy rural, but kind of, it had that feel, very blue collar, Southern Baptist church, 100 people, 150 people. And man, the one great thing about that was if you were called to preach, they would put you up there when you're 17 years old.
That's right.
Or whatever it is, right? But I think there was sort of this idea prevalent in that type of church that was, you don't want to tinker with the guy that much because that's interfering with the Spirit.
Man, that's the way I thought about it.
Yeah.
That's the way I thought about it for myself. Even the first time that I preached, I'm like 18 years old, going to this church, got this sermon that I'm taking in, scared to death, but I just get up and I do the thing, and all this cool stuff happens. I get into seminary and I take like a preaching class. And not only did I not listen to that, I never listened to that first sermon that I preached that was like recorded on a cassette tape, but also in the preaching class, one of the things that we were supposed to do was watch yourself on video. And I never did that because I literally thought this. If I watch it, I'm going to find things that are wrong. I'm going to be self-conscious about it, and I'm going to dial in on trying to change those. And it's going to take away from the gift that God has given.
Yeah.
How backward is that?
Right. That's really backwards.
Yeah, really backwards.
But hey, it's not uncommon, right? And so what we want to talk about today is what we think is one of the best things we've ever seen for helping individual sermons get better and developing preachers, and that is the sermon planning process. Now, that is not, honestly, I'm using the term that we use, it is not self-explanatory, okay? By sermon planning, what we mean is a 1-hour meeting that happens when the preacher for the week is down the road, but not too far down the road.
Like percentage-wise.
Sweet middle. I'd say they're probably between 50 and 60. Okay. And they're not too far down the road, but they are a little ways down the road.
Yep.
And we sit for 1 hour with a diversity of people from our staff, from different places and all of that, to speak in on the front end. And that is kind of the key, okay? This is not a critique. It's not looking back. That's one of the things that and I'm not saying that's unhelpful. If I had all the time in the world, I may want to do that too.
Sure.
But what I, could never get my mind around is what's the purpose of let's all sit around and talk about how good or bad it was after it's over.
Yeah. When you have the opportunity to make it better.
Okay, 5 or 6 years from now, I might dust this bad boy off, and glad I have those notes. But my big fear would be, somebody comes up with this incredible illustration an hour or two after the last sermon for the weekend is preached. And it's like, well, it would have been way better if we could have thought about that on the front end, right? Sure, yeah. So what we want to talk about today is this sermon planning meeting. We just call it sermon planning. Again, that's not self-explanatory, but it is a meeting that happens with 7 to 10 of our staff and whoever is going to preach that week, where they come in prepared, like you said, maybe 50% done or 40 to 60%, something like that. And the theology part's almost totally buttoned up. It's just not, maybe in a form that is real applicable yet or very illustrative yet. Yep. And then we bring that to them, we walk through it, and we just talk about it. We talk about all of the facets of it. And in so doing, 2 things happen. We get better sermons and we get better preachers. So let's take it in turn, okay? The first, and I, Jonathan, I wanted you to be on the podcast I want you to talk about any of this that you want to, primarily though to talk about the development side, because that's what you're into and you lead all these cohorts and that kind of thing. But first, let's talk about how sermons get better when we talk about them on the front end in community, all right? The first thing I would say is this, that sermon planning helps make sermons sticky, all right? We have this thing at Mercy Hill when we're talking to guys about preaching that we say we want to both get it right and make it stick.
Yeah.
If you get it right, but you don't make it stick, we would say
Doesn't really matter.
it doesn't really matter that much, right?
Because people don't remember it, so that nothing changes.
Now, the flip side of that is if you don't get it right, you probably don't want it to stick.
That's true too.
Right? So we want to try to get it right and to make it stick. Sermon planning is primarily about trying to make it stick.
You've done the work of getting it right before you come in the room and bring it to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, you just preached a couple weeks ago. I mean, by the time you got into sermon planning, because you've been in the system now for a while, what are the things that were already pretty buttoned up?
Yeah, I mean, I had the pathway through the passage of Scripture that I was preaching that week, knew kind of the main points, and so I came in saying, hey, can you help me get some of the language around this better so that it sticks in people's minds?
Yeah, so that's right. So when we think about making it stick, the two things that come to my mind, I'm going to quote him a few different times here because I was shaped by him, are applications and illustrations, all right? If there's three parts to a sermon, explanation, application, and illustration. If there's three parts to what we're doing when we're preaching, most of the explanation stuff is happening in the closet.
Right.
You know, you're kind of, man, I got my commentaries, I'm listening to other sermons, I got, whatever. We're doing that process. We want to make sure we get it right. Sermon planning is primarily then about illustration and application, or you even bring up another one, just wordsmithing.
Right.
It's about language. We'll talk about that in a minute. But for illustration and application, I want to try to make a quick argument that if we're doing that by ourselves, man, I know guys that have said they've heard me talk about sermon planning and they're like, man, I don't know that I could ever do that. It's funny to me. I don't know that I could ever not, right? Because I have understood now how 7 or 8 people in the room gives me 7 or 8 times the amount of ideas for something to help pop, to make something stick for somebody in terms of an illustration or an application. J.D. Greer would say it like this: there are 10,000 illustrations for any point. You just have to give yourself enough time to find them. One way you give yourself enough time is by getting way ahead. There are guys that are writing their sermon today for a month from now. I have never been able to do that. Man, I don't know. I need the pressure. I need the moment. I'm too preoccupied with what's coming this week to think about anything else. All right. So another way to do that, to give yourself time, is to multiply the experiences of the people that are in the room and to hear what they have to say in terms of a certain illustrative point.
Yeah, I think to your point where you're saying that you can't imagine yourself not doing this. I came into this world not doing this. And I would say that here at Mercy Hill, I preach probably more in other churches than I do here at Mercy Hill. And even though I'm not preaching here as much as I am in other churches, when I'm preaching in other churches, I still use the same process. Right. Where I bring guys around and say, hey, let's fill the room and get the voices in the room to help this thing be better.
And it's great. And I mean, this is getting a little bit off or ahead, but man, the young guys here, because they know this is our rhythm, they do it too.
That's right.
And they jump at the chance. Hey, man, I need 1 hour. It's not 10 hours. I need 1 hour of everybody's time to make this thing pop and to try to help us get it sharp and dialed in.
And they want the opportunity to help.
I think they want the opportunity to help, to learn. The other thing I would say is it's not just about illustration, right? Making it stick is application. Another quote from Greer here. And these are not, I don't think he's ever written on any of this stuff that I know of. I'm just going back from, things that he said that just stuck with me forever. And I think this is really true. A great application beats a good illustration or great illustration all day long. And what he meant by that is if you craft a statement or a question that cuts somebody right to the heart and gets right to the heart of it, not an explanation, but in an application, you taking it and bridging it over, that John Stott thing, walking over the bridge, right? If you get that question, it's going to beat an illustration. It's gonna make something stick in a way that even an illustration maybe has a hard time doing. And either way, having more people in the room is going to help us be able to do that.
Yeah.
Help us be able to craft that thing. I was thinking about this. There's a book called Humor Seriously. We try to use humor in sermons here. We try very hard to do the whole when you're preaching, you get to be the pitcher and the batter.
Yeah.
So throw yourself the best pitch. So guys that have some humor in their life, they're good storytellers, man, guys that are very, football coach or whatever your shtick is, you try to. And so humor is one of those things that I feel like I try to lean into it a couple times every sermon if I can. And it's funny because in this book, Humor Seriously, humor is so memorable. Mm-hmm. It creates a footnote, an anchor. I don't know how. I mean, God has just wired us this way. It's the famous study was, I don't know if in 2011, Obama had in his State of the Union speech, you never see this, but he had a joke in the State of the Union. And it was a joke about how complex the government is. And here's what he said. He said, the Interior Department is in charge of salmon while they're in freshwater, but the Commerce Department handles them when they're in saltwater. And then he said, I hear it even gets more complicated once they're smoked. And they did a study on it. Nobody could tell you anything about the whole speech. Everybody knew the salmon joke.
Wow.
The point is, like, when you're sitting in a room, I don't know if you've ever been in the situation where you're like, dude, the well of creativity is dry. Mm. And I could stand up and I could just go rote, explanation, conclusion. Yeah. And we could do the running commentary, you know? But if I'm trying to create on-ramps for people and anchor points in their mind and be creative, it really, really helps me when other people in the room have good humor, gripping stories, and things that help make people stick.
Plus, when you're going through something that's really heavy content, a difficult passage that's really punching hard, and all you're doing is just going straight through it that way, and you don't have any humor, it's like people can't stay engaged with it through the entire thing. And
right.
So those moments of humor kind of release the pressure valve and let everybody take a breath so they can lean back in to what you're teaching.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's funny because I'll hear people say well, use humor in sermons. John Piper don't use humor in sermons. And I'm like, yeah, you ain't John Piper.
That's a big point.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like the certain person that's like, well, Tim Keller preaches his sermons in 27 minutes. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not Tim Keller. Right. If I was as good as Tim Keller, I could do that in 27 minutes too. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like, I mean, there is something about different styles, but I mean, generally the mere mortals among us,
right,
like me and like you, we're going to need to use every tool that's available.
That's right.
Right? Because, of that. Okay. Another thing I would say about better sermons happen when we do sermon planning because it multiplies a preacher's experience. You probably noticed this in our seminary we have here on our church campus, but I know this is really true. Another Greer thing here. Your sermon will sound like who you've been talking to that week.
Yeah.
And so if you've been talking to a firebrand prophet, guess what? If you've been talking to a bunch of seminary people, it's going to be intellectual. If you've been talking to a bunch of if you've been listening to nothing but talk radio, what is it going to sound like? Yep. It's just a human thing. Like you're going to kind of think about the passage and your communication style is going to sound like who you've been talking to. The great thing about sermon planning, when you've got 7 to 10 people in a room, 1 hour, here's my sermon, what do you think about it? I think it's just the simple idea that you're multiplying the experiences of all of those staff members or high-level leaders, and they have been talking to people.
Yeah.
And so what comes to their mind is something different than maybe what comes to your mind, and you end up with stories of actual people that come out of the congregation.
All right, so let me ask you this.
Yep.
We're saying 7 to 10 staff members.
Or high-level leaders.
Right, so think about you're in a church that doesn't have 7 to 10 staff members.
Right.
Or doesn't have 7 to 10 high-level leaders who are available during the day to be able to pull off something like this in the way that we do it. What would you say to guys like that?
Well, we didn't either. When we planted Mercy Hill, we had 30 people, and that was it.
Yeah.
So we just did sermon planning on Thursday nights at 9:30. That was a put your big boy pants on moment.
Yeah.
I mean, for 2 years, every Thursday night. And it was our way of bringing people into leadership. I mean, we only had 2 staff members at all. So it was me and one other guy that was part-time right when we moved here. He came on full-time pretty fast. So our sermon planning would be at my kitchen table, and we'd invite anybody that we thought may eventually be a group leader. And we brought them in. I think the big church thing of you got 7 staff and they're all in there and all that, and we could never do that. It's really not true, man. You do this sometimes with other guys that aren't even staff. Maybe they're ministry resident type people. I was doing this when I was the young professional pastor at the Summit, and we would have 2 or 3 of our people every other Thursday before I would preach. We would come together for that. So I get what you're saying, but there are ways to do this. They're high sacrifice ways, but in the beginning or in a smaller church, it is certainly something you can still do.
Awesome.
I think that, one of the things we try to do with the multiplying of other people's experiences, you can talk about this. Sometimes it's very easy for us to get locked in to what is going on in our life stage.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you're kind of empty nester, Corvette, getting huge tattoos, midlife crisis guy. Okay.
I appreciate that.
Is that right? Did I nail it or what?
I mean, some of those things may apply.
No, okay. I'm kind of joking, but the reality is, like, you're naturally going to look at a passage and think, man, I got a bunch of peers that are recently empty nesters that are trying to figure out this new stage, right? I mean, that's just natural. I'm going to do the same thing with my stage of life. How helpful is it when you have a sermon planning team that you walk in? Age is different, gender's different, marriage is different,
All of a sudden, you've got illustrations that are coming from people that are singles.
Yep.
You've got illustrations that are coming from people that are that because it's fresh. They're giving illustrations that are about like their young kids and those kinds of things. I don't tend to think about that stuff anymore.
Right.
But when that happens and I can use an illustration that's like that, it helps me connect with people that are sitting there listening to it that, wouldn't normally be, wouldn't connect to some of my illustrations.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, for me, that is one of the biggest things that has been helpful. I'll give you an example. And this is kind of a charged example, but it literally happened. So I remember I got in a shtick maybe, I don't know, I can't remember when it was. We were over at Edgefield, so it had to have been like 8 or 10 years ago. But like for like 3 sermons in a row, I used like a Lord of the Rings analogy.
You like Lord of the Rings?
I do like Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And a lot of guys I naturally listen to like Lord of the Rings. But one of our elders at the time, Pastor Gary Rivers.
Okay. I can see where this is going.
Yeah, you can see where it's going. He pulled me aside and he's like, hey man, black people don't do Lord of the Rings. Now, I don't know that he's qualified to speak for all black people on Lord of the Rings, but my point was he was trying to help me in actually a very gracious way to say, hey dude, let's diversify some of the ways that you're grabbing and some of the literature that you're grabbing from or some of the things that you're grabbing from, And I just thought that was very helpful for me, to start thinking about, okay, yeah, you're right, man. Like maybe, because I mean, maybe he was right about that or maybe not. What is certainly true is there's a lot of our congregation that is not into Lord of the Rings, whatever race they are or whatever. And maybe I needed to like stop relying so much on my experience and try to grab for some other illustrative material.
You needed to go straight Hunger Games.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I heard Keller say this one time, that one of his elders came to him and they could tell, this was crazy, they could tell whenever he had been a little bit lazy in sermon prep. And he said, how? And the guy said, because you quote a bunch of C.S. Lewis the whole sermon. Mm. And is the idea, like, I'm going back to what I know. I'm going back to my source. And, I think that the diversity of people in the room from all the different stages we've talked about really helps you multiply the experiences so that you can hit a broader perspective of the church when you're trying to, quote, make it stick. Yeah. Another thing I think that is, is really helpful for me is that this is kind of weird. Sermon planning gives me a chance to verbalize some of the thoughts that I've had on paper, but to do it with an audience. Mm.
You get to hear how it comes out.
Yeah, and you get to watch people's reaction to it. I mean, you get to see, like, was that as funny as I thought it was? Did that hit? Oh, that was a little bit of a double meaning there, and I didn't really realize it, or that was kind of a pun I didn't know, or what? And I don't know, man. For me, you never know that when you're sitting in the room writing it. You only know it when you have said it out loud in front of people at some point. This is why I think, like, man, some of the preaching was so hard during COVID.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of guys that didn't have a sermon planning process, you know, all of a sudden they're on they're not able to read the room of how is this landing. Yeah. And next thing you know, it's posted and it's like, man, that didn't land, you know, like I thought, but I couldn't tell because there was nobody there. I'd rather have that experience
in a room
4 days before.
Right. Yeah.
We're going to do it. One of the things that's funny to me too is that, and you mentioned this, so I want you to kind of go with it, but some of the best wordsmithing sort of happens where you take an idea from, this is a 3-sentence intro to a paragraph, to bang.
Yeah.
It's tight. And sometimes that happens right there in the meeting.
And I mean, in our setting, you know, that's going to be Randy Titus is going to be able to throw that stuff down. Brian Miller is really good at those kinds of things. There are just some guys that are really gifted with making something come out in a way that people are going to remember.
Right. So that's a good point that you bring up that I want to make sure we say, okay? When you're in sermon planning, there needs to be a contingent of that group that is there to strictly help the sermon get better.
Right.
You mentioned 2 of our guys that I always want in there for that exact reason.
Mm-hmm.
Man, I just value their opinion. I think that they think about things well. They're able to kind of clearly articulate something that I might be dancing around, wordsmith, that kind of idea. There's also a contingent we're going to start getting into. They're there completely for the development side. That does not mean they can't have a good idea.
Right.
But they're there for the development side.
Yeah. Yeah, those are the guys that they want to be able to preach. Mm-hmm. And so what you do is you put them in the room and they're getting to not just watch the process, but they're getting to be a part of the process. And so as they get to be a part of this over and over and over again, they naturally just start thinking this way and start building their own sermons this way.
That's right. Yeah. And that's what we're going to get into in our next episode when we start talking about the second big part of this, which is better preachers. It's not just better sermons, but it's better preachers. Yep. And I think that's what we're after, right? Like, we're after the sending component. And so that's going to be a huge part of this deal. Hey, man, let's leave it there. If you have not checked it out already, we have a good private Facebook group that just talks about all things practical church growth and going. Yep. And also, Jonathan, you want to give them a plug for the conference coming up this fall?
Yeah, we would love for you to be able to come to the conference. It's going to be amazing this year. Going to have some great teaching there. And we think it's going to be way bigger than it was last year. And I think some of the best stuff that happens from that are the conversations that take place between churches that are coming and interacting with the content. So
yeah, and it gives you a chance to get around some other churches that are not hiding under a rock.
Yeah.
While they're talking about growth.
Yeah. They all of a sudden it's like, I'm not the only one that's thinking about this kind of stuff.
That's exactly right. Yeah. All right, man, we're going to leave it there. Thanks.